Eventually, during the Clinton years, our government made a secret pact with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan to end the chaos in Afghanistan by introducing a new force called the Taliban.
Because we certainly don't want to fight their fight, because you'd be fighting for a dysfunctional, unrepresentative, authoritarian government. And there's no reason on earth that I know of that we would ever sacrifice a single American life for that. It is a, however, serious potential crisis with broad regional and even global consequences.
We noted that our private security in Afghanistan appears to be a major source of payoffs to the Taliban. Our report has the first official statement that it's the second largest source of money to the Taliban.
After drugs.
After drugs, that's right.
ISIS was born in Iraq but metastasized in Syria and then came back for a double or nothing game of whatever we have in front of us. We have an organization that does not recognize the Sykes-Picot boundaries, as they call them, that have divided the Middle East for over a century. So my question to you is, and I guess it's to Aaron and Ambassador Jeffrey, but Mike can also chime in, what do we do on the Syria end of this equation? And how does it affect particularly the debate that we've seen recently with Ambassador Robert Ford's call to arm the Sunni opposition in Syria? Thank you.
Very quickly, we had a horrible Syrian situation which threatened to do exactly this kind of game-changing thing for a couple of years, and we didn't do very much about it. It metastasized, and it's the mess we have now. And we're going to have that mess tomorrow, next month, at least, and for months into the future, regardless of what we do or don't do. What's different right now is these guys are moving on a path that, as Aaron indicated, and as I fear, could be an immediate, dramatic game changer to the entire Middle East. And so there's a difference in perspective. And it's very hard to communicate this. I've been trying to do it for 3 days. The president tried to do it and was not completely clear in it.
So the map that you see in front of you gives some basic areas of control now. The green map, the green area that you can see is the unarguable 3 provinces of the Kurdistan region government area of Iraq. The large black area is the area in which government control has largely collapsed. That doesn't mean it's an ISIS control area. That means that no one else is in control of the area. So it may be ISIS, it may be scattered government forces, it may be local militant actors in those areas. And just to briefly explain the lines that you're looking at, the lines on this map show a red line or an orange line, which was the Peshmerga's forward edge of control just before this June crisis. And now you see a light blue line, which is their current forward positions. And it demonstrates how they've moved forward along pretty much the entire disputed line, encompassing almost all, or at least very many of the disputed areas that they claim, certainly the ones that they care most about. And then when you see the black area of loss of control end at the bottom of the map, you see a pencil-thin corridor from Samarra, which is the stop line, the defensive line, where hopefully the tide will be stemmed. Balad, the Air Force base where the F-16s were supposed to go, but they may now be relocated somewhere else when they arrive later in the year. And Taji, right at the bottom of the map, which is the refitting and rally point for the destroyed units, a major logistical base in that area. And as can be seen from this, I want to point out 2 things about the way the battlefield is evolving at the moment. First, looking at strategic geometry. If you look at it, ISIS in Mosul have got great strategic depth in terms of the distance that the federal forces, once reconstituted, would have to travel between Baghdad and Mosul. Tremendous strategic depth, 350 kilometers of contested terrain. But ISIS's west-east strategic depth is actually very limited. And that really underlines the potential role the Kurds could play. ISIS has 350 kilometers of strategic depth north to south. but they've got in many places as little as 10 to 30 kilometres of strategic depth west to east. The key things that they want to hold on to are within very close striking distance of Kurdish forces. And this really underlines how vital it is to get the Kurds fully into this fight, and that means that the government has to come to the Kurds with a solution on some of their revenue sharing and oil authority issues. And Baghdad has to make some compromises. We can all argue about the fine points later, but for now, there's a bigger issue to deal with. The Kurds are already fighting at a number of points of the map. For instance, Hawija, which you see just west of Kirkuk, where Peshmerga ground forces are working with remnants of the federal security forces and federal air power. Likewise, where the Kurds have moved forward to take control of these disputed areas, the Iraqi army buffer between them and ISIS is now gone. So they are undertaking, they're taking casualties. You can see martyrdom statements coming up on Kurdish social media sites and news sites showing that the Kurds are in the fight against ISIS. And it couldn't ever be any other way. The Kurdish leadership hate radical Islamists. They suffered extensively from their depredations in the past, and they're not willing to have a major ISIS control centre within an hour's distance drive of Erbil, which is the economic capital of Kurdistan. No successful emerging economy in the world has been able to have a huge Al-Qaeda presence in a city of 1.8 million people just an hour's drive away. So this will not be acceptable to the Kurds, but we need to swing them fully into the fight, and that means a political deal. The second brief observation I want to make is that we need to pay a lot of attention to the moral dimension of this crisis. By my estimation, speaking to people in Iraq, a full 60 of the 243 Iraqi army battalions, combat battalions, cannot be accounted for now. 60 out of 243 cannot be accounted for right now, with all equipment lost. So this is a mammoth refitting job to put these units back together and to arm them properly for combat. And this is an area where the US will, I'm sure, once again become the arsenal of democracy. No one likes the idea of having to refit the Iraqi army yet again after the US taxpayer did it the first time. This time Iraq will be paying. So anyway, one aspect of this is the refitting role. But as important as that, turning around a defeated army and enabling it to fight again, and I've embedded with the Iraqi security forces. They're a military with a long tradition, quite a proud tradition. Amongst Arab countries, they're one of the best militaries, and they have many proud achievements to point to, including defeat of the militias in 2008 and their part in the surge, which defeated Al-Qaeda the first time. But they need to be turned around. As any commander will tell you, the acme of skill for a military commander is to take a defeated army and turn it around. If you look at Viscount Slim of Burma, his account of turning the defeated British army around, which is called Defeat, his points are laid out in great detail, and it's one of the most difficult tasks you can imagine. This is where the US can play a key role. It wouldn't take that many US commanders embedded at divisional level and above to insert some wisdom into the way that the Iraqi securities pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and get back into the fight. One of the key elements of this is taking baby steps, feeding these units in a way that they can win small successes, small easy battles that rebuilds their confidence for the larger battles which will come as they get further north. The final thing I'll say as well is that the provision of US military assistance on the ground is something that we need to think very seriously about, as I'm sure the President is. Having listened to his remarks, I hope what I'm detecting there is that we're playing hardball with the Iraqi government about coming out with a political deal, about ending all of this sectarian nonsense, ethnic bullying of the Kurds. If some of the very disruptive Iraqi government policies can end, I hope we are willing to help out this long-standing ally. If we put US air power into Iraq right now, it's not a silver bullet that will solve everything. but it would have tremendous moral effect in terms of supporting the Iraqi military. They know what US air power can do. It's a massive boost to them whenever they know that there's some US air power at their backs, ready to help them out if things get really, really tough. You don't need to use a lot of it for it to have a tremendous amount of moral impact. And for people who say, but how can we be sure where the strikes are getting targeted? Don't we need people on the ground? I have to honestly say, yes, we do. We do need a Joint Special Operations Task Force on the ground. It doesn't need to be massive, but we do need eyes on the ground. When we turned around the Libyan regime's near destruction of the rebels at Benghazi, when the French airstrikes and other airstrikes turned that around, that had enormous effect. And there are many instances in Iraq where I can imagine a little bit of air power going a very long way. Now, we've already got boots on the ground in Iraq, the people at the embassy, including the military training mission. So I really wish this boots on the ground phrase would leave our lexicon, because it just doesn't mean anything. It's an excuse not to do something. We already have boots on the ground. Use whatever legal conceit is required to get some US advisors up to the forward headquarters and to get them on the front line. And I'll say this with the caveat, they could already be there right now, but they're keeping it low. If that's the case, fine. But if it's not the case, it's something we should very seriously consider. If I have space for just one final comment, it's not hard at this stage to imagine Iraq becoming Syria. And by that I mean northwestern Iraq going the same way as Raqqa in Syria, under ISIS control, perhaps semi-permanently, like Fallujah, just 35 kilometers from Baghdad International Airport. It's also not hard to imagine the Iraqi government, if we don't give them sufficient backing, turning to somebody who has a proven track record of protecting their allies, and that's the Iranians. They, through themselves and Lebanese Hezbollah, stabilized the Assad regime's defense. And, you know, it's unfortunate, but when I was in Baghdad in March speaking to the top-level leaders, what I heard is that the Iraqi government feels it needs to use some of the same formula that Assad did, and maybe some of the same helpers as well. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Shiite Islamist militias. So really, this is the time for a desperate plea to the US government on behalf of all the Iraqis out there who are willing to fight hard. The US needs to make a credible gesture at this time, a credible gesture of military support right now. And if we're using the withholding of military support as a lever on the Iraqi government to come up with some kind of political deal, good. But I hope there's the baseline determination underneath that to eventually do something to stabilise the situation. It can't be a cosmetic half measure. We've had too many of them, I think, in recent years. We have to commit to the defence of Iraq. And we can't leave Iraq to ISIS or to the Iranians. And those are really my comments.
And Jim, do you want to speak from the podium?
I'll speak from here if it's okay. Oh, well, no.
Because I put the map back up.
Oh, okay.
So it might be useful while...
Yeah, the map's great. Okay. Mike, what I'm going to say is going to parallel, not surprisingly, much of what you said. First of all, everybody, thanks for coming here today. About 2 months ago, it seems like 2 years ago, when I was diverted from my main job looking at the Middle East into Ukraine, I wrote something saying that the Crimean situation was the biggest challenge to the United States since 9/11, if not since the end of the Cold War. I've changed my opinion. What's happening right now in Iraq is the biggest challenge to the United States and the international order since 9/11 at least. And here's why. Back in September, President Obama addressed the UN General Assembly. And he said, in the Middle East, which is still a cauldron of most of our security concerns and a large percent of our troops, there were 4 critical issues that would require all elements of American power, a euphemism, of course, for military force. Securing the oil lines, combating international terror, standing by our allies and partners, and weapons of mass destruction. Other than the last, at least for the moment, the All three of the others are very much in play right now. The largest concentration of al-Qaeda we have ever seen anywhere, compared to Pakistan, Yemen, you name it, is in this combined area of western Iraq and on into Syria. And they are the nastiest of all of them. Secondly, we've already seen oil prices spike. Iraq is the second largest exporter of oil in OPEC. The IEA estimates it could go up to 6 million barrels of production a day, 2/3 of what Saudi Arabia on some days produces by 2020, if it remains stable. This is not a recipe, folks, for stability. Granted, the oil fields are in the Kurdish north or in the deep Shia south around Basra, but in all kinds of ways I won't get into, but trust me on this, if there is instability in Iraq, and particularly if we have no government worthy of the name in Baghdad, you're not going to have a whole lot of development in the oil sector anywhere, except perhaps in Kurdistan. So, our interests are very much at stake. Clearly the President and the U.S. government realizes that. He's talked twice about this. Let's try to take a look at the factors that he's being briefed on. I'll keep it short, and I'll keep it to what General Casey used to call the major muscle movements, because at this point, that's what we should do. Speed is of the essence, and a lot of the things I and everybody in this audience could say about Iraq that is relevant and true isn't important at this point. There are only, in the next few days, and we're talking about days here, a few things that are really crucially important by the major actors, and there are 6. Most importantly, there's ISIL, and we'll hear more from Mr. Zelen in a second on what makes them up. They're facing a decision. They've seized almost all of the Sunni Arab areas of Iraq. The question is, do they carry out their threat and go after Kabbalah, Najaf, and try to besiege Baghdad? They certainly can. I know the area to the north and to the south of Baghdad. It still is an area of where al-Qaeda has always had a presence. It's mixed Sunni Shia areas. And they've already this morning seized 2 of the towns in Diyala province to the north and to the northeast of Baghdad. So they could pretty much cut it off from Salman Pak to the north, to the southeast, all the way around towards Bakuba to the northeast. And the problem is, even if they can't take the city, and I'll get to that in a second, I don't think they can, the question is, how do you get fuel, food, water, electricity, and all the other things a country, a capital, 5 or 6 million people, and an army needs if they're surrounding you? I'm not speaking theoretically. In 2004, with 130,000 American troops in country, that was the situation we faced not most days, but some days in Baghdad in June, July, August, being hit by the al-Qaeda people from the west and the Shia militias from the south and out of Sadr City. And it was very, very tough, even though we had all these troops and we had overwhelming air power. I'll come back to that. So ISIL needs to make a decision. We'll have to see what they're going to do. That's the most important thing, because if they do decide to stay in the Sunni areas, then we're going to have a classic counterinsurgency. The things Mike laid out that will need to be done for reconciliation, some of what the President said today, all true. American troops are not going to liberate the Sunni areas of Iraq. That's going to be Kurds, Sunnis, and Shia or nobody. We'll provide the logistics, we'll provide the training, and we can provide overwhelming firepower in the months ahead. But I don't think we're going to do it, and I certainly wouldn't recommend it. Because if they're not going to fight for their own country, then we shouldn't on the ground, because it would be bloody. But that's a long-term, as history goes, question. If ISIL is pushing towards Baghdad, the President is faced with a very different situation, given, as Michael said, we've got a large contingent of Americans right in the middle of this thing, and given what can happen to Baghdad and how the other actors, the other 5 actors, play. The first of them is the government, the Iraqi army, which is not entirely but largely composed of Shia ground soldiers, and some of the Shia militias that are also in this mix. If together they can hold, maintain their cohesion, use their vastly superior firepower and their extraordinarily large number of superiority in troops to hold territory where their families live, then we won't have to worry about a siege. they'll be able to push these people back and keep enough roads open. It'll be messy, as it often was in 2004, but they can do it. But that's a big if, folks, from what we've seen in Mosul and elsewhere. If they can't, that is, looking at the first of the 6 elements, if ISIS decides option B, to go for Baghdad, to surround it, and if the authorities are not able to break that siege, I'm sure they're strong enough to avoid being overrun. A city of 6 million people is not going to be overrun by 800 or 2,000 or 5,000 people. I'm almost sure of that. But they may not be able to maneuver, use firepower, coordinate effectively against people who are very good at this time, and they may find themselves essentially besieged. So if you get through those 2 decision points, you get to the other 4 actors. The next one is the Kurds. They're now, as Michael said, sitting on a new green line that includes most of the mixed areas with this Kurdish populations. To quote Masoud Barzani to me at one point, if there is danger anywhere a Kurd is living, there will be the Peshmerga. And that's essentially what we have right now. So they have 2 other choices, depending upon how things go in Baghdad, how things go in the country. They can, as you can see, they are on either side of Mosul. They're right along the fault lines with the ISIL. They can move forward, push these people back. They have a lot of heavy equipment. They have well-trained troops. And they can exert tremendous military pressure on ISIL if they want to. On the other hand, if they see a total mess, disintegration, Iranian domination to the south, they're out of Iraq, Inc., in my view. They've talked about this for years. They've opened certain options, but that's something to watch. So they've got decisions too, based upon these other decisions. The next actor is the Iranians. If Baghdad is besieged, if some of these cities that are so important to Shia Islam in the south, Kabbalah and Najaf, are under threat, it's very hard to imagine the Iranians not acting if somebody else doesn't act. And the consequences of a Shia-Sunni Gotterdammerung in the middle of the Middle East are just beyond calculation. Second to the last actor is the Turks. They're in a very awkward position because they have 80 people, including their entire consulate in Mosul, seized by the ISIL people. That puts limits on what they can do, but they are still a major actor with a major military capability and very close ties to the Kurds. So watch them. The final actor is the most important, that's the United States. Many of you have just heard the president. It's a somewhat mixed message at this point. What he's saying is he's going to consult with Congress to look at his options. He ruled out ground forces, and when ruling out ground forces, he's talking about major ground forces. Not necessarily forward air controller teams, trainers, and other things. He's already got military trainers on the ground, or military advisors on the ground. He didn't rule out airstrikes, but he didn't rule it in either. What he said was, I can't do anything militarily without a political process. Again, going back to the first of the 6 actors, if ISIS stays in Sunni Arab Iraq, that's a totally intelligent, acceptable, and smart way to move forward, because all he can do is provide the aerial firepower for somebody's ground forces, and if that somebody's ground forces don't show up for the fight, there's no sense us dropping bombs on people. But if ISIS is moving south, if we're facing either a siege of Baghdad and almost certainly the Iranians coming in a big way, we have to act quickly. And then if what he's saying is essentially, I'm going to leverage my decision to use force to get the best possible political deal, that's smart politics, that's smart diplomacy, and more power to him. But if, having tried for 4 years in Iraq or outside of Iraq to get exactly this kind of reconciliation and political deal and failed miserably, if what he's telling us is until that happens, the planes will stay on the aircraft carriers in their fields, and ISIS is moving forward, then other actors are going to shape Iraq and they're going to shape the Middle East while our planes remain on the ground. That's the question that he's facing today. One last thing before I'll stop. People will say, and Mike addressed it very, very well, well, you know, what are we going to hit? What targets? 1972, the North Vietnamese invaded something called the Easter Offensive. It was exactly like 1975 where they overran the country, and in fact they're well on their way to overrunning the country even quicker than in 1975. And then the planes came. The F-4s, the B-52s. You could feel the ground rumble, and every Vietnamese soldier, ARVN soldier, could feel the ground rumble. Suddenly they stopped running and they started fighting. Bit by bit, they held their ground. Bit by bit, they threw back the North Vietnamese army until, by the Paris Peace Accords, all but one small town had been retaken in the entire country. We had people on the ground as forward observers, that's true, but nonetheless it was the use of military power, it was the use of air power, sometimes not knowing exactly where the enemy was, that turned the tide. Again, in Libya, many times we didn't have ground observers, but what we were dealing with were flying columns of highly mobile Gaddafi regular army troops. What we're dealing here with is essentially a pickup truck, and now pickup truck and Humvee army of ISIS people roaring around at 30 miles an hour. They're vulnerable to airstrikes. And there are ways to get forward observers in if it's the will of the United States to get them in. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Aaron?
Thanks for coming out and for everybody watching online. So I'm going to be talking about ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham, and sort of get into the details of who they are, what they've been up to, and what we could potentially see. So this didn't necessarily come out of nowhere, even though it's sort of been portrayed as if it has. There's been a reemergence of ISIS, which originally is the group that Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was in control of last decade, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They themselves have changed their name and rebranded over the years to try and have a better time operating in Iraq as well as in Syria more recently. So they started reemerging in April 2013. This is when ISIS decided to extend its control beyond Iraq and into Syria last year. This is also the time when they officially broke away from Al-Qaeda itself. Al-Qaeda then, in early February 2014, confirmed that ISIS was no longer in the organization. The thing to remember about ISIS is that while the Sahwa movement and surge did push them back, they were not completely defeated. There was still at least 300 people that were killed per month in Iraq from around 2008 until April 2013. So what was important about Syria is that they were able to pour resources, get new money, as well as fighters back into Iraq when they were operating inside of Syria. One of the things that we've seen in the past 6 months or so is that there have been a return of foreign fighters into the Iraqi arena. Many of these originally just went to Syria to fight against the Assad regime, but from there, ISIS then plucked them and brought them into the Iraq zone to fight as well. Since April 2013, we've seen violence rise 3.5 times more than what we saw on average for the previous 4.5 years. In addition, one of the things that helped them out was that they had a prison break last July at Abu Ghraib, where at least 500 individuals were released from prison. Some of these guys were arrested and detained during the Sahwan surge timeframe. And many of these had experiences, and therefore that further provided more levels of competency to ISIS's operations. And, of course, we saw earlier this year that they were able to take over Fallujah and parts of Ramadi. Another additional aspect of what ISIS has been doing that we did not see last decade and is one of the reasons why people were in a backlash against them originally was that they've had a hearts and minds strategy, whether it's providing food, medicine, religious classes, outreach to tribal figures, as well as allowing people in the Sahwa movement to repent and join their cause without getting killed. Therefore, more and more victories has raised the level of prestige of this organization. ISIS operatives now operate in both Syria and Iraq and view the border as nothing more than going from one province in their Islamic state to another, not going from one nation state to the other. So after Mosul was liberated, and it should be noted that ISIS was not the only fighting force, there were also Baathists, Naqshbandis, as well as some other Islamist factions that were involved in the takeover. When ISIS takes over an area, they view it as now under their sovereign control, and therefore every individual within the territory must pledge bay'ah or allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the group. And if you don't go along with the program, you essentially you have a death wish. So this is the backdrop to how they plan to rule, as well as what they're going to lay out. So yesterday morning, they released the Wathiqat al-Madina, or a charter of the city, to Maslawi residents. In it, it highlights more prohibitions on actions than things that people can potentially do. So if you steal, you'll get your hand chopped off. You have to perform all 5 daily prayers on time. Drugs, alcohol, and cigarettes are forbidden. Carrying non-ISIS flags and or weapons is illegal. All shrines and graves will be destroyed since ISIS views them as polytheistic. And women must dress modestly, which is just a euphemism for the full body niqab. It also notes to Sunnis within the town that if they worked within the Maliki government and institutions, that if they repented, they would be fine and wouldn't be executed. We also already have a case study of how ISIS does rule in Syria. So I'm going to highlight some of the ways they've been in charge, in addition to the criminal aspects. So it's not just all terror. They have a soft power aspect too. So when ISIS took over al-Raqqa in Syria, they started setting up by putting up a lot of billboards in the city that had themes related to jihad, Sharia, women's sacredness, and other themes related to piety. ISIS also tried to initially reach out to local notables and tribal figures because they wanted to blunt or stave off any potential backlash that could happen in the future, in the same way that we saw last decade in Iraq when there was the uprising against ISIS in the mid-2000s. What most people don't realize is that ISIS's operations are highly sophisticated, and they do have a bureaucracy themselves too. So I'm just going to go through sort of how they've actually been governing these areas in Syria. So in terms of the law and order side of things, they have Sharia courts. This is where they can, throw down their rulings related to somebody getting their hand chopped off for thievery, or people getting summary executions for apostasy. And we've even seen a number of individuals getting crucified, which I'm pretty sure not many people have seen in the modern era in many hundreds of years. And they also have a police service that roves around. They have a consumer protection authority, which looks at the different souks and markets and places where you can get food in local areas in Syria, and decides whether a food product is edible or not, essentially in the same way that I guess the FDA would do something. They also have a vigilante aspect of their law and order side, where they burn cigarettes and destroy shrines and tombs. And we saw one of the more larger tombs or shrines in Raqqa being destroyed earlier this year. In terms of public works, they helped build a new market inside of Raqqa. They have an electrical office which helps train and repair electrical services throughout the town. They've had a lot of road work done in some areas as well, where they've rehabilitated roads, whether it's in terms of putting up plants in the medians. And they've also been able to continue operating the Tishreen Dam, which they call Al Farouk now. In addition, they've set up a zakat office, or almsgivings, to provide money for the needy. And they claim that this helped also with farmers in their harvest. They also are now conducting a postal office inside of Raqqa. On the more ideological side of things, they have dawah stalls for their media outlet, Al-Ittisam, where they pass out DVDs of video releases that they've put out online. In addition, they have a dawah truck which roves around with a lot of different things related to Islam and their ideology, and stops in certain areas and talks to children and adults and tries to teach them their interpretations of Islam. In addition, they've set up a number of religious schools for boys and girls, and if you memorize the Quran, you can get a certificate. They also have provided kid fun days, where kids can, play around on these inflatable slides and moonwalk type of devices, as well as have food and eating contests. In addition, for older members of society, they've created sessions for imams and preachers to be trained. In terms of more regular social services type things, they've helped run bread factories and provided fruits and vegetables for many people. And they've even set up a food kitchen for the needy. They also have set up an office for orphans to help register them and then hopefully try and place them with a family. And while the Taliban has been very paranoid about vaccinations after the CIA operation against bin Laden, there have been vaccination programs put out by ISIS in Al-Raqqa province. They even have this Cub Scouts program, which is far more worrying because you have children from the ages around 6 to 14 that are now in these housing places in Raqqa and then put into training camps. So essentially they're having child soldiers being set up as well. So what's next for ISIS now? This is sort of what the potential could be. This is what we're seeing in Syria, but this is what the potential could be in Iraq now that they've taken over some areas. Well, it's likely that they'll try and consolidate their strength with the new money from the Mosul Central Bank, which allegedly is upwards up to $425 million, which is far exceeding any money that Osama bin Laden had. There are already rumors that they've been buying off people inside of Mosul. This will also be used to reinforce the front in Syria. As many people know, earlier this year, a bunch of Syrian rebel groups started an uprising against ISIS and pushed them out of Idlib and Aleppo Governorate. It's likely that they'll use this to further reinforce Al-Raqqa Governorate, help out on the Deir ez-Zor front, as well as try and push back into Aleppo and Idlib. Some of the questions I have currently is are they stretched thin? They have 7,000 to 10,000 people, but they span all the way from the countryside in Aleppo all the way up through Mosul now. Can they actually hold this territory? There are many people that obviously do not like their ideology and do not want to live through this. And obviously, the type of penalties that they pursue is created a backlash in the first place last decade in Iraq. We've already seen statements put out by some tribal members in Ramadi and Mosul about how they're going to stand up not only just to the Maliki government, but also to ISIS themselves. The fact is, though, is that the Islamic State is a reality. ISIS's ability to crisscross provinces within its state could prove difficult for completely dislodging it from either territory and could provide more ability to consolidate its proto-state. For jihadists worldwide, the continued battlefield victories registered by ISIS and the perception that the so-called will of God is on its side against numerically superior enemies will only enhance the prestige of joining the group and furthering its goals. So this is the state of ISIS right now. Obviously, it's a lot different than sort of what Al-Qaeda was up to last decade, but it's a very sophisticated and organized organization, and this will be a lot more difficult to dislodge than anything we've seen before. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those sobering remarks. Mike, are you with us?
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right. Let me open up a discussion session by asking you, Mike, if you can bring us up to date on the reports concerning Iranian military involvement, who it is, where they are, what do they seem to be doing?
Well, it's very difficult to come up with categorical information on this without being in country and seeing it with your own eyes. I spent a lot of time studying the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and indeed meeting them on many occasions quite unnervingly. But what I found was that they were, let's just say, the Iranians have been very nervous since 2007 about risking IRGC officers directly inside Iraq. Now, since the US left in 2011, I'm sure some of that fear or trepidation has gone, and we have seen senior IRGC officers killed on the other side of the border over there in Syria. So it's very likely they've got military advisors at key points operating in many ways how I'd like to see US officers operating. One thing's for sure, wherever you've got these US officers operating, you're very unlikely to have Iranian officers operating in the same places. And, that, if anything, that's a good reason for having US officers in the front line.